All right, and now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today. First up, I've got Douglas Fisher. Douglas Fisher is professor and chair of educational leadership at San Diego State University and a teacher leader at Health Sciences High and Middle College. Previously, Doug was an early intervention teacher and elementary school educator. He is a credentialed English teacher and administrator in the state of California. In 2022, he was inducted into the Reading Hall of Fame by the Literacy Research Association. He has published numerous articles on reading and literacy, differentiated instruction, and curriculum design, as well as books such as The Teacher Clarity Playbook, Your Introduction to PLC Plus, The Illustrated Guide to Teacher Credibility, The Teaching Reading Playbook, and Welcome to Teaching. Thanks for being here, Doug. Next up, I have Nancy Frey. Nancy Frey is professor of educational leadership at San Diego State University and a leader at Health Sciences High and Middle College. Previously, Nancy was a teacher, academic coach, and central office resource coordinator in Florida. She's a credentialed special educator, reading specialist, and administrator in California. She's a member of the International Literacy Association's Literacy Research Panel, and she has published widely on literacy, quality instruction, and assessment, as well as books such as The Artificial Intelligence Playbook, How Scaffolding Works, How Teams Work, The Vocabulary Playbook, The Teacher Clarity Playbook, and Rigor Unveiled. Next, I'm happy to introduce Sarah Ortega. Sarah Ortega is a coordinator for instruction and supports for English language learners at Health Sciences High and Middle College, and served as a classroom educator for 19 years. She was recognized as the 2023 Chula Vista Elementary School District Teacher of the Year, and her teaching videos have been featured in professional development training and educator magazines. She's also a professional learning consultant and works with schools and districts to design and implement learning solutions that support the emotional, behavioral, and instructional needs of students. Thanks for being here, Sarah. Next up, we have Kierstan Barbee. Kierstan Barbee holds a doctoral degree in educational leadership and literacy from the University of Houston. She brings almost 20 years of education-related experience in pre-K-12 settings. She served as a secondary English language arts teacher, academic coach, and professional development supervisor in large urban districts. She served as a project manager of Assessment for Learning, which involved creating system-wide professional learning programming for central staff and campuses that promoted the spread of research-based practices. Through an emphasis on relationship building and human-centered design principles, Kierstan has coached pre-K through 12 principals, teachers, and district leaders on pedagogical practices that promote equity and student agency in learning. And a fun fact about Kierstan, she's the one that drew the illustrations for the Teaching Foundational Skills to Adolescent Readers book. So that's what you can see right up here.
Yes, she did.
And last, but definitely not least, our triple threat, Aida Rotell. Aida is currently a full-time professional learning consultant for Corwin and a teaching clinician. She was previously a bilingual teacher in an elementary school where she taught grades K through 6 for 15 years, as well as a high school special educator, academic coach, coordinator of services for multilingual learners, and an administrator. She holds teaching and administrative services credentials in California and earned her master's degree in education from San Diego State University. She's dedicated to developing teacher and leadership mindsets for diverse learning populations. Aida is also the co-author of PLC Plus, a playbook for instructional leaders. Thank you, everyone, for being here today and for letting us all learn with you. And now I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to pass the mic to Doug.
Oh, thank you. And Aida, I think, has every credential they offer in California. I really do. Well, welcome everybody for this interesting conversation. I hope you'll find it as intriguing as we did in getting ready to do this work. We'll start off with the need. You know, there's a need for adolescents. We spend a lot of our energy as a profession talking about young children and learning to read. Super important. but reading development continues across our students' lifespan. We have to continue their reading growth and development. And then some students, unfortunately, fall behind and need additional support to be successful as they become proficient readers. In some people's mind, there's these pendulums that swing back and forth and back and forth. We don't really see it that way. We like to think of our profession more along the lines of a drill, that we're drilling deeper each time we come back around to some topics. Nancy and I have been around long enough to know that these topics in literacy cycle back through our professional conversations. We get very much into like learning more about this and then learning more about this. But it's not like we just swung to do this and then swung to do that. In reality, we're drilling deeper and deeper and learning more and more about what it takes to teach our students really well. Now, my guess is that you all know the reading rope for elementary. It is old. It's been around. This version of it's 2001. That is a few years ago. Importantly, it has held up the test of time. This is an explanatory framework for thinking about the components of reading for young kids. Nancy and colleague Diane Lapp and I made some suggestions. We argue there's some changes, some revisions that we need for the reading rope. Things like morphological awareness, theory of mind, pulling out alphabetics as its own strand, and then reading fluency. But that's really not what we're here to talk about. My point here in showing you this is there's a strong framework. This is one of them. There's a very strong framework for how we think about reading development with younger kids. And Hollis Scarborough's work focused on young kids and students with disabilities and built the rope from that knowledge base. It did not include older students. So Kierstan, Aida, Sarah, and I, and especially I want to acknowledge this was motivated by Sarah's doctoral dissertation work, which she will graduate in about a month from today. So we were all having this conversation about what does it mean for adolescents? Adolescents are not just older versions of young readers. And so we set out with Sarah having a pretty significant lead in this to look at what does the evidence say about adolescent readers? What does the evidence say around what a framework might look like if we only looked at grades 4 and above? And if we took out all the early literacy and we took out all the special ed, what would we see? And through quite a process of negotiation and different visuals and graphic organizers, we started thinking about what foundational skills would be important for older readers. What would, if we know the foundational skills are things like phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, alphabetics, if we know those are foundational for young kids, what would be foundational for older students? And how would we target those approaches? And if students weren't on track, how could we intervene with them in ways that honored them being 15 or 12 or whatever? So a lot of negotiation. Unfortunately, many chart papers got destroyed in this, and we apologize to the world for that. But we had to figure out how to convey this very broad knowledge base of grades 4 to 12. And we came up with this. Now, I don't know if it's a power cell or a battery. Is it a charging station? I don't know what it is, but I really like it. And here's what we know, and we'll spend some time with you all on each of these aspects. What you don't find commonly in early literacy is self-efficacy. And the research on older kids is that self-efficacy is a primary driver of their reading achievement. If they don't believe that putting forth effort is going to allow them to achieve goals, they don't put forth effort. Hoodies up, heads down, checking out, maybe misbehaving, disengaged, etc. That we have to address the efficacy of our students as they age. That efficacy powers the effectiveness of our instruction in the other areas. Background knowledge fills the power cell or the battery or whatever language you like. It's all around all of those because background knowledge or knowledge is highly predictive of what you understand about reading. Now, right now we are in the knowledge revolution in reading. We are hearing all kinds of conversation like we didn't know this in the past. I'd like to point out that Hollis Scarborough's 2001 version of the reading rope has background knowledge or knowledge in it. So we've known about the role of knowledge for a really long time. Yes, it is very popular right now to talk about knowledge. And appropriately, we should be looking at the role that knowledge plays in reading. And then there are these 4 areas in the middle. For adolescents, for grades 4 and above, do they recognize the words? Do they know what the words mean? Do they know how to put those words into sentences that make sense? And then do they engage in verbal reasoning, which is inferencing, and comprehension. Now you'll notice some of those have some similarities to the primary grades, but some do not. You don't see, for example, sentence analysis in the work with young children. And we'll highlight the role of sentence analysis, that learning to analyze deeply the role that sentences play and the words in those sentences is a really important part of helping adolescents learn to read. Nancy, do you want to comment on this as well? Because you also were deeply involved in the research review to identify, to cluster these components.
Yeah, I think the other side of this too is what does this look like in classrooms? And the research around older students and reading development is pretty intensive, especially as it applies to intervention. And in fact, one of the elements that we have in the book as well is around intervention, but less so with what it is that this looks like in classrooms, how it is that teachers can really use text and be able to support the development of those reading skills while still paying attention to their content. And I will go ahead and do a special shout out for that last one up there, verbal reasoning, as being an essential part of what it is that adolescents need to be able to acquire. And I'm going to talk about verbal reasoning in just a bit. And Doug, I think you're going to take us into self-efficacy.
I was just thinking about this idea of self-efficacy as you were finishing that thought, Nancy. Sorry, that, efficacy, individual and collective, is this idea that I can accomplish the things I want to accomplish, the goals I have. So I was thinking about that. If you don't have a goal, then it's not really going to help you become efficacious, because you got to have a goal. And you have to have evidence that you're making progress towards that goal. And in the terms of reading, our students have experienced a lot of failure. And they've been told that they don't read very well. And teachers put really hard things in front of them. And they don't feel very efficacious. And it's no wonder they start checking out of reading.
Mm-hmm.
We want it to grow. We want reading to grow where students understand. Yes, and the motivation module, yes. We want students to know that reading grows, and older readers need to feel successful. And we say all the time as professionals to our students, you learn from failure. And I want to challenge this idea that you learn from failure, because adolescents, older readers, need to experience success. So we say all the time, you learn from failure, you learn from failure. And I want to challenge that, because it's not a guarantee. If I put a hard piece of text in front of you and ask you a bunch of comprehension questions and you fail at that, giving it to you again doesn't mean you're all of a sudden going to get it. If I give you the same math problem 25 times and I get you, 26 is not a miracle and you suddenly know how to do it. We want students to experience that success on a regular basis. And this has to do with something in the research world around this idea of success ratios. When students experience academic success, they're more likely to engage in the behaviors that led to that success. Success is motivational. In fact, practice makes permanent. Yes, In fact, what we know about our brains is our brains love learning from success. Our brains don't love learning from failure, although we can learn from failure. Our brains don't love it. The neurosciences show the brain studies, if you image a brain, when you're experiencing success, the reward pathway gets flooded with neurotransmitters. We love it. It feels amazing. And we want to do that again because it feels good. So there's this thing called the success-failure ratio. And there's this ratio that exists in every content area of all of us, and how much success you experience versus failure. And students whose success-failure ratio regularly tips to failure come to expect failure and don't put forth any more effort because they expect to fail. When their success-failure ratio tips to success, they come to expect success, and then they see mistakes and errors as temporary setbacks because generally they're successful. If you would have asked me a couple months ago about the success-failure ratio, I would have said more than half the time students need to be successful. The studies are 85%. You have to be successful 85% of the time for students to tip the success-failure ratio. The challenge with it is, do you just make things easy? And I hope the answer for you all is no. That you keep the challenge there and you get students to experience success. So it's a simple example. At our school, because of the success-failure ratio research, optimal learning, we started having multiple success criterion for every lesson, not just 1, 3, 4, whatever. And the first one is accomplished in the first 15 minutes of class. And I'll tell you, when teachers chunk it and they take an 80-minute period and they divide it into several opportunities for students to experience success, it is highly motivational. What's next? Because I've already experienced success on that. What's next? I've already experienced success on that. If we can, in the world of adolescent reading, help students experience success more often than failure, our instruction has a chance of sticking. Now, I'll make a quick connection before I let my colleagues start talking. There is something called academic risk-taking. It's how willing a student is to ask questions, ask for help, share ideas, and choose to do hard things. Academic risk-taking is all wrapped up in your success-failure ratio. You will not take an academic risk and say, I was reading this and I wonder about this. I wonder if the author thinks this. You're not going to engage in academic risk-taking if you expect to fail. So we want to build academic risk-taking, but it has to do with the success-failure ratio.
All right. So then, Doug, what can we do as educators to really help our adolescent readers? And this model is not just about for teachers of English language arts or reading language arts. We're really thinking all content. What is a tier 1 approach that we can take in the day in and day out to make sure that we are capturing all of our readers and building better readers? And so this section about background knowledge, Doug talked about it a lot, but we know that background knowledge is a better predictor than just reading skills alone. And there was a landmark study in 1988 by Donna Recht and Lauren Leslie, and they found really that struggling readers who had strong knowledge of baseball outperformed high-skilled readers who had no knowledge, right? And so sometimes we're just like comprehension strategies, this, that, and the other, but the way that learning works, which you can kind of see referenced by this diagram, is that our bank of knowledge, we have our schema or these knowledge networks. And as we read information, the information that already exists in our schema or those knowledge networks starts connecting with the words on the page. This is largely how comprehension works. So you saw this slide was called, or the one before was called From the Known to the New. And our colleague John Almroad will often say knowledge moves from the known to the new. You don't just pump skills and knowledge into existing structures where there are no structures. Knowledge about the topic matters more than just general reading ability. So then we think about, well, why does background knowledge matter? What are the effects? And we see that background knowledge is really essential for making meaning while reading. It's essentially the cognitive glue that connects the new information that students are reading in a text to the known information in their heads. We found that students with limited prior knowledge really struggle more with comprehension, even when they're otherwise motivated or strategic readers. And again, it goes back to this idea that new information that is not anchored in existing information is often just discarded. So we see then on the next slide that a lot of cognitive scientists really use this idea of a coat hanger analogy, saying basically, if I don't have a coat hanger or a hanger in my mind to hang on the new knowledge, we just drop it to the floor. And so we talk about this in three big buckets. We think about usable knowledge, okay? And usable knowledge is not just disconnected facts. We don't want students just to be Jeopardy trivia champions. We want them to have knowledge bases. And so usable knowledge is organized, right? It's structured into networks that allow me to easily access that information. And then we see that it's also conditionalized, where students know when to apply that knowledge and where to apply that knowledge set. And then lastly, we see that as we think about background knowledge, it's also transferable. We want students to be able to take their newfound knowledge that's connected with the known and transfer it to different contexts. So then we have to think about, well, so what do we do, right? We know that if we need to leaven the playing field in terms of background knowledge, then we have to provide intentional instruction that both activates and builds on the background knowledge of students. This could be through multimedia or pre-reading or discussions or different types of text sets or cross-content integration. And our goal here is that we're really able to narrow those gaps, because the rich get rich and the poor get poorer when it comes to cumulative knowledge and secondary that builds over time. We hand it over to Sarah to talk about word recognition.
So, hello, everyone. Thank you, Kierstan and Doug, because yes, both self-efficacy and background knowledge on a topic, both can be considered foundational, right, for adolescent readers. But then students also have to have the ability to read the words on the page, right? That's what word recognition is, that ability to decode a word quickly and effortlessly. And that's that battery component that Doug was referencing earlier. And we'll talk a little bit about orthographic mapping in a bit. But the problem here is that when students have to work really hard just to recognize the words on the page, it's going to eat up their mental energy. And that mental energy is what they need to be able to understand what it is that they're reading. And that's going to impact their confidence. That's going to impact their academic success, right? And so when we look at the research, this is some really interesting research, this longitudinal data by Wang that came out in 2019 and then again in 2024. It shows this idea of this concept of a decoding threshold, meaning that students that are scoring underneath that threshold, their kind of ability to kind of decode the words on the text, they're not making the same growth in reading comprehension as their peers who are reading above that decoding threshold, even when they have a strong reading comprehension intervention in place. The students who are reading above that threshold are going to engage in what Cher in 1995 calls some self-teaching, meaning that a strong decoder is going to come across a word that they've never read before, and they're going to be able to decode it, recognize the pronunciation of that word from spoken language, and they begin to create this link, this connection between the orthography, the spelling of the word, the phonology, the pronunciation of the word, and then semantics, the meaning of that word. But you need a certain level of decoding skills in order to make that happen. You need to know how these letters, how these graphemes are connected to the sounds, those phonemes. And when those decoding skills are inadequate, there's going to be slower reading growth in all of those kind of reading sub-skill sets, even again, when you have a reading comprehension intervention in place. And so this really tells us that reading the text is important for students' academic success and their sense of self-efficacy. So what's an efficient way to kind of do this? So an efficient way to quickly decode words is through this process called unitization. When we think about the commerce sector for a minute, that term unitization, that means that's the process of when items are grouped together, like in these larger units, like pallets or like these large containers. And why is that done? Well, that's to make those kind of items easier to store and handle, kind of transport easier, right? Well, our brains do the same thing. After we have orthographically mapped units of words, those units are easier to recognize, to maneuver, and students need to know that that series of letters are connected to a sound, and with multiple exposures, our brains map or connect those letter sequences and store them in our long-term memory. And so when we run across that word, we can access that word without the process of decoding again. And when we do that, LaBerge and Samuel say that if we can do that, we're reading with automaticity. Right? And I always encourage educators to consider incorporating a fluency routine in the secondary world. It can really do wonders to support both word recognition, and you can structure in a way where it also supports the concepts of the content in which you're teaching as well. Right. And I know fluency practice sometimes is common at the elementary level, but there is lots of research out there that shows that intentional practice of repeated readings through fluency practice at the secondary level, it's needed all the way through high school. Right. And part of the reason for this fluency practice is to model some work around multisyllabic words. Right. Anita Archer and colleagues said that kind of students who are falling below a grade level fall into two categories. Those students who have some unfinished learning in the area of being able to connect those sounds and letters in that relationship. But there's also a group of students that you might find in classrooms that they're able to kind of make their way through a lot of text. They've memorized kind of a high bank of high frequency words, but they really struggle with decoding multisyllabic words. Right? That's where many of our students are struggling, is they're reading their way through the text, but they're stopping or skipping over those multisyllabic words. And we can help students with multisyllabic words because we can teach common patterns, but we can also teach them about syllable junctures, the places where the syllable meets. But even more importantly is that we can teach students to be flexible in the way that they chunk words and the way that they can try adjusting the vowel sounds in different syllables, right? We can teach them about the morphological parts in words and how to identify those prefixes and the suffixes and also the Greek and Latin roots that are so essential to the disciplines at the secondary level, right? And also they help to unlock some meaning there as well, right? So being able to read words fluently and with automaticity means that the cognitive load for the student it gets a little bit lighter, and the learner can focus on other important aspects like word knowledge and sentence analysis and verbal reasoning. And with that, I pass that conversation to my esteemed colleague, Nancy.
As Doug had laid out, the model that we developed also includes word knowledge. You certainly have got to be able to recognize the words, and you also need to have word knowledge. In other words, possession of the semantic features of words and word phrases and so on. Each of these, when we talk about word recognition and we talk about word knowledge, each of these, the more knowledgeable the student is, the more likely it is that they can dedicate more and more of that bandwidth to those critical thinking skills, to the kinds of higher level comprehension that are needed, especially as students move through the middle grade years and into secondary, and those texts get more and more complex. And we know that the relative load of word knowledge, vocabulary, if you will, increases exponentially as students move out of the early years of school, and increasingly the texts that they are that they need to be able to read and learn from and to be able to discuss and talk about have higher and higher lexile levels. And lexiles in this particular case is not a Lexile is not a commercial product in this particular case, but rather what Lexiles mean are those units of knowledge that Sarah talked about before. That also applies at the word knowledge level as well. And it's important to note that when it is that it comes to especially how it is that we learn and how it is that we are able to draw from the learning that happens, we have to pay close attention to vocabulary development. And when we're talking about vocabulary development, we don't simply mean memorizing a list of words for this week and then having a test on Friday. That what we want to be able to do is to embed our word vocabulary instruction into connected text, to be able to connect those not just as isolated units of knowledge, but really in understanding how it is that they work within the reading that they're doing. Being able to engage in things like composition, for example, is an essential part of word knowledge, not just being able to recognize them, but actually being able to utilize them in terms of their word knowledge. Being able to ensure that there are routines that are in place that students can learn from those vocabulary. We don't want to make it so that there are so many different vocabulary routines that students are spending way too much brain space trying to figure out what it is that the teacher is going to do this week to be able to deepen vocabulary knowledge. We want to utilize some of those routines in order to be able to really build that out. And Michael Graves and others were really foundational in helping us as a field to be able to understand what it is that vocabulary really means. And when we talk about what does it mean to know a word, or what is it to know a word phrase in particular, it is a measure certainly of breadth, how much we know, but it's also a measure of depth. How well do we know those words? And again, as students move into increasingly more sophisticated content, what they're encountering on a regular basis are words that have lots of different meanings to them, that are contextualized, that are understood only in the context of how it is that those are being used. Some things to consider in terms of building out that word knowledge include understanding that morphological awareness is an important part of understanding vocabulary and reading. As Sarah had talked just a few minutes ago about the importance of morphological awareness, and certainly within the reading field, morphological awareness is increasingly being understood as being an essential part of this. When we teach students about things like Latin and Greek root words and where those come from, we're encouraging that morphological awareness and understanding of derivations. We need to teach individual words, but we also need to be able to teach the word parts and how it is that those morphemes that are in there change not only the speech that's being used, the voice that's being used, but also how those are being used. One other element that I'd like to emphasize when it comes to the depth of knowledge and to the breadth of knowledge is that, importantly, this is also about cognitive load. This is something that Kierstan alluded to a bit earlier as well. Cognitive load is all about the amount of knowledge a brain can process at a given time. And when students are struggling with the vocabulary piece in it, in particular, it increases the cognitive load, and it therefore decreases the amount of brain space that they have to be able to work through what those ideas are about. So making sure that we are building background knowledge, ensuring that students have the word recognition skills that they need, and to continue to build that out through vocabulary vocabulary instruction are key parts of this. So what does that look like in classrooms? That can include things like students being able to engage in self-assessments. What's your familiarity with this word? And to be able to track how is it that you are learning more about what this word or this phrase is. I'll take physics as an example. Physics is littered with words that students are often familiar with at the surface level, words like motion, for example. But when it comes to physics, words like motion take on a different kind of meaning, a deeper kind of meaning. It includes things like being able to build out those routines, making sure that students know how to do hexagonal thinking. And in particular, what that means is, are you able to make associations between words and ideas in order to do so? Vocabulary, word recognition, as well as word knowledge are deep and rich areas of instruction, and they're essential for being able to bring those to classroom teachers so that they can see how their content fits in to some really sound ideas around reading instruction. When it comes to vocabulary development, what's important to note is that some of the learning that we do is incidental. We hear it through those interactions and so on, but we also need to be able to understand that there's explicit word instruction as well. And being able to teach those word solving strategies, like using your word parts, understanding what the context is, and using resources is essential for doing so. When we have teacher-directed explicit instruction of those words and that morphology, and being able to convert it into some student-friendly examples, we help to give them a toehold on that unfamiliar vocabulary. And that's matched by multiple exposures. We know that students aren't going to learn a whole lot of new vocabulary simply by having a few exposures to that, mostly passive exposures to that, and then moving on from there. They need lots of opportunities to be able to actually utilize what that looks like. That active engagement is an essential part of this, through composition, through writing, through discussion, and so on. Those are essential for students to really be able to solidify what it is that they know about the meaning that those words carry. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Aida, who's going to go even deeper around the idea of sentence analysis, word recognition, word knowledge, and now sentence analysis.
Thank you, Nancy. So sentence analysis is really one of those strategies that is overlooked, especially in adolescent literacy. And when I'm talking about sentence analysis, I am not talking about 1982 when we would diagram sentences, which was my entire 9th and 10th grade English class. What we're talking about is our kids, our secondary grades, we know students struggle not just with words, but how those words are arranged. And we know constantly, we assume, because kids can decode, students understand what they are reading. And as sentences get more complex, we see that kids will shut down, right? We've all had that opportunity to read a chemistry book or read a textbook and just shut down because we know all the words, but we don't know what we're reading. So as we think of this, we know that the reason sentence analysis is so important. We know that analyzing sentences is really powerful. Levitt talks about it improves not just reading, but it improves comprehension. Thinking of students that have those uneven reading profiles is super helpful for students who can decode, but then don't always understand what they're reading. So I say it bridges the gap between phonics and that full text comprehension. So we have to figure out ways on how to break down what they are reading, and sentence analysis really helps our students with this. So if you think about it, and I love this quote from Stanley Fish, it really captures the importance of syntax. And when we think about it, words alone aren't enough. It's the way we put them together that creates that meaning. And we have to help our students see how language works at that sentence level. And thinking about, grammar, sometimes we this is just we kind of suck the life out of it in our elementary grades. So we know that syntax matters. So what I'd like you to do is I would like you on your own to insert the word only in this sentence. And when you'll see that the sentence will have a different meaning depending on where you put the word only. So take a second to read our 6 different sentences. And we definitely see that when we talk about this, you will see that it is about making meaning. And a lot of times we believe that kids should be able to do this. And how do we build activities that build that metalinguistic awareness, which we know supports comprehension and then transfers to writing? So I always say syntax works. It's just not about the grammar. It's about meaning making. So as we think about why this matters, right? Our older students, we see it all the time. I am currently in a high school. We know that studies confirm that complex syntax is a barrier to comprehension. And that's where we see those kids shut down. We see those kids not have that self-efficacy. So how do we teach students to analyze structures? It can dramatically improve their ability to make sense, and show them how to attack academic text, how to read more fluently. And we know it's the game changer definitely for our struggling readers. So as you think of this, I believe and I know academic language is dense and unfamiliar. And so it reminds us that students must, and I think of going back and apologizing to so many students I've taught in my years in education, that they need to be taught how to explicitly unpack language. And especially when we think of content areas. So I know that when we started, we said, this is not just for your ELA teachers. This is really critical when we think of all the content areas and all of the meaning that is hidden in so many complex sentences. So thinking about our areas of social studies, math, science, that's where our kids need to be able to analyze the sentences in those content areas. So I say that the language of schooling is complex. And so sentence analysis is really a high leverage move. We talk about empowering kids. We want to empower kids to be able to read independently and critically. So I challenge all of us to shift from correcting the grammar to teaching students how to structure builds meaning. So how do we get our students to become little scientists and looking at sentences not just as moving through, but really digging deep into what the meaning is behind it. So thank you. We're going to go now move into my colleague and friend Nancy on verbal reasoning.
And thank you, Aida. And I am going to talk about verbal reasoning, but I wanted to address a question that Laura had in the chat. Laura had written and she said about what does this look like in math in particular. And Aida was thinking about sentence analysis in particular as it applies to mathematics. And there's a process that's called juicy sentences. And juicy sentences can be utilized in any content area, including mathematics. And so taking a word problem, for example, and really deconstructing that with students. What is this question asking us? Who is asking what that question is? How are we making connections? How are we understanding how to break these sentences apart to be able to identify in particular what the math vocabulary is that's in there, but also too to be able to understand the reference. Who are the pronouns that are being referred to in here? What's the relationship with all of those? And taking just a couple of minutes to be able to unpack a rich math task, for example, to be able to pull that apart so that students can identify the who, what, when, where, why, how that's happening in there can be incredibly helpful for students. And by the way, you're not going to hurt anybody if they already knew that, but chances are very good that you're going to have lots of students who appreciate that you did that. And so let's turn our attention to verbal reasoning, which is the last element that we talk about in terms of powering up readers. And this is a place to be able to really pull together so much of that information from background knowledge and word recognition, word knowledge, as well as sentence analysis. Verbal reasoning is about thinking with the words across the text. And verbal reasoning, probably all of you remember encountering that when you took an SAT or an ACT. It's a measure that's on there. For some of us, it was the first time that we ever saw that particular phrase. But verbal reasoning actually has a really strong representation within reading research. And by definition, verbal reasoning is your ability to be able to process, to be able to analyze, make sense in logical and critical kinds of ways. In this case, as it applies to written text. Don't get thrown by the word verbal as thinking that it only means about speech. It does absolutely relate to listening comprehension, but also reading comprehension. And think about the relative sophistication of all of these, making inferences, connecting ideas, evaluating arguments. These are all what are sometimes referred to as higher order kinds of skills. And what verbal reasoning supports is deeper comprehension, not just surface level comprehension. Hey, I understood this at a literal level, but how can I go deeper for that? And some of the research around verbal reasoning in particular has been around problem solving specifically, and the connection between verbal reasoning and students' ability to be able to engage in problem solving in multiple disciplines. It's an interesting longitudinal study that was done with 25,000 students that started out in kindergarten, and the researchers followed these students all the way through 8th grade to be able to kind of figure out where are they at? What are they doing in terms of their verbal reasoning? And unfortunately, although not surprisingly, I suppose, to any of us, by the time that they got to the end of 8th grade, their ability to be able to engage in the higher order verbal reasoning had diminished quite a bit. In fact, by the end of 8th grade, only 37% of students were able to critically evaluate informational text, and less than 10% of them were able to evaluate complex syntax. In other words, taking those sentences apart. I'll go back to sentence analysis again. This is certainly reflected as well in some of the more recent NAEP scores that we've seen with the decline in students being able to engage in critical thinking skills. Some things to consider around how it is to teach for verbal reasoning in particular. And these are things that teachers can do, especially in modeling how it is that we as readers consider and pay attention to and plan for our learning, monitoring our learning, and reflecting on our learning. That as a reader, being able to ask oneself, what do I need to do to get ready to engage in this lesson? What information on this topic do I already know? In terms of being able to monitor one's understanding, is this a time when I should ask for help from my peers? Or where did I get stuck? Or what was the most confusing thing about this information or this process? That's an essential part of being able to engage in verbal reasoning. You have to know where it is that you're getting tripped up. And then also to be able to reflect on the learning. What are the 3 main points from this lesson? Or how actively was I involved in the learning? What decisions did I make during learning that were either beneficial or that detracted from my learning? Verbal reasoning is something that we can teach toward and we can model how it is that we utilize that. We don't just simply read a couple of paragraphs in our US history book because the teacher asked us to read that and then go on from there. We have to think about, how am I getting ready for this? How am I monitoring my understanding? Am I able to reflect on the learning that I've engaged in? And all of these are essential in order to be able to really gear up students for being able to read. They have to have the self-efficacy. They need the self-efficacy to be able to power their reading, to engage in challenging tasks. They need to be able to have that threshold of decoding skills. When they don't have that threshold of decoding skills, and we have some students who don't, then intervention is absolutely essential, but it needs to be the right kind of intervention. Intervention that is specifically around helping them to be able to learn how to decode so that they can benefit from that comprehension instruction and comprehension intervention that's so important as well. They need lots of opportunities to be able to engage in word knowledge as well as sentence analysis kinds of work. And especially, we need to teach toward verbal reasoning, making sure that we're modeling how it is that we use verbal reasoning and being able to create opportunities for them to be able to engage in verbal reasoning as well. So our model for adolescent reading includes all of these aspects, and it is not solely the job of the English teacher to be able to figure out all of this, but rather that it's an opportunity for schools to be able to engage on a school-wide basis in how it is that these ideas, these skills are expressed inside of each of our disciplines. Word knowledge, word recognition, sentence analysis, verbal reasoning are going to look different in different content areas. However, all of us are able to be able to lift that up, and especially to teach toward the idea of building self-efficacy, of making sure that there's lots of opportunities for success. It's time for some new thinking, and not only trying to figure out how good research-based frameworks for early literacy can somehow be bolted on to adolescent literacy. Adolescents are deserving of the kind of attention to what it is that we know about what works with adolescents. We have to be flexible in what it is that we are thinking about, foster ownership, and make sure that students have a toolkit of strategies and the agency to use the right one at the right time. Each strategy that we want students to use must be explicitly taught. And with that, we'd like to thank you for this short time that we had together. We hope that we have sparked up some good ideas and some good thinking for you. And Megan, I'd like to turn this back to you.
All right. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day and you are well, and we can't wait to see you the next time.